You still think rules matter, Olivia? He chuckled seconds before handing me the severance folder. He didn't know he was about to forge a federal document with a signature that no longer existed. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because 2 weeks earlier, I buried a handshake protocol in our system that only I could complete, and they just triggered it. My name is Olivia Harlow. And until recently, I was the compliance officer at Meridian Defense Systems, a software company specializing in defense technology. That title sounds fancy, but in reality, it meant I was the designated party pooper, the person responsible for making sure we followed regulations that most executives viewed as annoying obstacles to profit. At 36, I was neither young enough to be easily intimidated nor old enough to command automatic respect. I existed in that professional middle ground where you're expected to know everything but still required to prove yourself daily. I remember the exact moment I realized I was going to be fired. It wasn't when Grant Remington, our CEO, started avoiding eye contact in the hallways. It wasn't when my meeting invitations mysteriously disappeared from my calendar. It wasn't even when the CTO accidentally excluded me from security protocol updates. No. I knew I was marked for removal when Grant hired a digital transformation consultant who spent 3 weeks shadowing me, asking questions about my workflow, and taking detailed notes about our compliance systems. No one shadows the compliance officer unless they're trying to figure out how to function without one. The actual termination happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Grant's assistant messaged me, asking if I could come to the small conference room, the one tucked away in the executive wing, conveniently lacking security cameras. When I arrived, Grant was alone, casually leaning against the table, his tailored suit jacket unbuttoned, a practiced smile on his face. Olivia, thanks for coming so quickly. His voice had that artificial warmth executives perfect for difficult conversations. I nodded, remaining standing. I noticed the manila folder on the table beside him. I'll get straight to the point, he continued, picking up the folder. We're making some structural changes at Meridian, streamlining operations, cutting bureaucratic drag. You know how it is. I do, I replied, keeping my face neutral. I knew exactly how it was. The board and I have been reviewing our processes, and we've determined that compliance is... He paused, searching for the right corporate euphemism. Becoming an impediment to innovation velocity. I almost smiled at that. Innovation velocity. The phrase sounded like it belonged in a bad business book, the kind executives quote to justify whatever they wanted to do anyway. We need to move faster, be more agile. Compliance is... Well, compliance is the enemy of speed, isn't it? He gave a small laugh, as if we were sharing an inside joke. I said nothing. His smile faltered slightly at my silence. Anyway, we've decided to restructure the compliance function, distribute it across departments rather than having it centralized. Translation: they were eliminating my position and dumping my responsibilities onto people who neither understood nor cared about regulatory requirements. You still think rules matter, Olivia? He chuckled, handing me the severance folder. But in today's market, it's about moving fast and asking forgiveness later, not permission first. I took the folder without opening it. I understand. My calm response seemed to unsettle him. He probably expected tears, protests, or at least a question about the severance package. But I had nothing to ask. I already knew what I needed to know. HR will walk you through the transition, he continued. They'll help you clear out your desk and return company property. Standard procedure. Of course, I replied. He shifted uncomfortably. You know, Olivia, you're excellent at what you do. It's just that what you do isn't what Meridian needs right now. I looked him directly in the eyes. We'll see. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Pardon. Nothing, I said, turning to leave. Good luck with the restructuring. As I walked out, I carried with me a single thought that kept me calm. He cannot forge that signature. 8 months earlier, I had been sitting in the same conference room, facing the entire executive team. The atmosphere had been tense. Our quarterly earnings report was due in 3 weeks, and Grant was determined to announce a major government contract that would boost our stock price. The problem, our sales director explained, is that the contract approval process takes too long. Our current compliance verification system is a bottleneck. It's not a bottleneck, I corrected. It's a necessary security measure for defense contracts. But it's manual. The CTO, Marcus Wells, interjected. We've developed an AI solution that can verify contract compliance in minutes instead of days. I leaned forward. You developed this without consulting the compliance department. It was a skunkworks project, Marcus replied with a shrug. Anyway, it works. We've tested it extensively. On what data? I asked. Historical contracts, he said dismissively. Look, it's just automating what you already do. Reading the contract terms, cross-referencing regulations, flagging potential issues. Grant raised a hand to stop our back and forth. Olivia, I understand your concerns, but this is happening. The new system goes live next week. Your job is to make sure it meets regulatory requirements. A week isn't enough time to... It's enough. Grant interrupted. Work with Marcus's team. Make it happen. I knew then I was being set up to fail. Either I'd approve an inadequate system and be responsible when something went wrong, or I'd refuse and be labeled obstructionist. So I chose a third option. I spent the next week in the IT department, working closely with the developers. I reviewed code, suggested improvements, and gradually earned their trust. Most importantly, I identified the verification sequence, the exact point where the system confirmed a contract was properly authorized. On Thursday night, when most of the team had gone home, I stayed late with Jake Donovan, a mid-level developer who respected my attention to detail. We were finalizing the authorization protocol. The system needs one more verification step, I told him. Really? Jake looked tired. The CTO signed off on it this morning. Federal contracts require additional security, I explained. We need a cryptographic signature protocol tied to the identity verification system. Jake rubbed his eyes. What does that even mean? I pulled up a complex diagram I'd prepared. It's a multi-factor authentication handshake that verifies the signer's identity through their personnel credentials. Jake glanced at my diagram, filled with deliberately obscure technical jargon and unnecessary complexity. This looks intense. It's standard for defense contracts. I lied. But we can simplify the implementation. For the next 2 hours, I guided Jake through adding what appeared to be a straightforward verification module. What I didn't explain was that I had designed the module to require a specific credential signature that only I possessed, linked to my personal employee badge and biometric data. When we finished, Jake looked at the code with a mixture of confusion and admiration. I'm not sure I completely understand how this works. Yo, that's compliance for you, I said with a smile. Complex by necessity. The next day, I presented the modified system to the executive team. I deliberately used the most technical language possible, throwing in unnecessary acronyms and regulatory citations. I watched Grant's eyes glaze over after the first 2 minutes. By minute 5, he was checking his phone under the table. So in conclusion, I finished. The system now includes the required federal verification handshake protocol, ensuring DFARS compliance while maintaining processing efficiency. Grant looked up. Does it work faster than the old system? Yes, I said truthfully. About 80% faster. And it meets all regulations. It does. Great. He stood up, effectively ending the meeting. That's all we needed. What Grant didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that I had just installed a silent failsafe. The system would work perfectly for all standard contracts. But for federal defense contracts, it required a final verification that only I could provide. And I had documented it nowhere except in the code itself, buried under layers of legitimate compliance requirements. It was insurance, nothing more. I never intended to use it. Until the day they decided they didn't need a compliance officer. The morning after my termination, I drove home in a strange state of calm. My personal belongings from 8 years at Meridian fit into a single cardboard box. HR had been efficient, escorting me out within an hour, deactivating my badge, and reclaiming my company laptop. They had already removed me from all systems, email distribution lists, and the company directory. It was as if Olivia Harlow had never existed at Meridian Defense Systems. I spent the first week sending out resumes and networking with former colleagues from other companies. But the defense contracting world is small, and word spreads quickly. Several promising leads suddenly went cold after checking with their team. I knew what had happened. Grant had blackballed me. By the third week, I had to face reality. I wasn't going to find equivalent work in my field anytime soon. My savings would last 6 months, maybe 8 if I was careful. I needed to pivot. That's how I ended up accepting a position as the assistant librarian in Willow Creek, a small town about 2 hours from the city. The pay was less than half my previous salary, and the work had nothing to do with my expertise. But it offered something I desperately needed: peace. The Willow Creek Public Library was housed in a renovated Victorian building with tall windows and creaking wooden floors. My supervisor, Eleanor, was a woman in her 60s who cared more about a person's love of books than their resume. She didn't ask why someone with my qualifications wanted to catalog local history archives and help children find picture books. She just seemed grateful for the help. "The community will love you," she assured me on my first day. "We've been understaffed for months." I threw myself into library work with unexpected enthusiasm. There was something satisfying about the orderliness of it, the clear rules and systems. Cataloging had its own compliance standards, after all. And unlike at Meridian, when I followed the rules here, people appreciated it. In the evenings, I lived quietly in a small rented cottage near the town square. I kept tabs on Meridian through LinkedIn updates and occasional texts from Jake, who was one of the few people who had reached out after my departure. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was simply waiting. 3 months after my termination, the first sign appeared. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Quick question, is there any way to see who actually signed off on a contract in the new system? Like, who specifically?" I stared at the message, my heart beating faster. I knew exactly what had happened. The system had rejected a contract because someone had tried to use my credentials after I'd left. I typed back carefully. "Why do you ask?" His response came quickly. "Big contract with DoD just got flagged. System says signature verification failed. Marcus is freaking out." I smiled to myself. "The system logs should show the verification path," I replied, deliberately vague. "Check those. It shows everything verified until the final handshake. Then it just fails. No error message, nothing helpful." Of course, it didn't show an error message. I had designed it that way to fail silently, without explanation. The only indicator was a small check mark that would remain grayed out instead of turning green. "Weird," I texted back. "Must be a bug in the implementation." "That's what I thought," Jake responded, "but no one can figure it out." Marcus asked if you left any documentation about the final verification step. "It's all in the standard compliance protocols," I wrote, knowing full well it wasn't. "Check Section 4.3 of the DFARS guidelines." Section 4.3 existed, but it said nothing about our specific implementation. It would lead them in circles for days. I put down my phone and returned to chopping vegetables, a small smile playing on my lips. The trap I never thought would be triggered had just been sprung. Over the next few weeks, I received sporadic updates from Jake. The system continued to reject federal contracts, and nobody could figure out why. Marcus had assembled a team of developers to comb through the code. But the verification module I'd created was so densely written and interwoven with legitimate compliance requirements that untangling it would require a complete system rebuild, something they couldn't do in the middle of a fiscal quarter with contracts pending. Then, one day, Jake sent me a message that made me nearly drop my phone. "They're using your credentials to approve contracts. Somehow they got around the system." I stared at the text in disbelief. That shouldn't have been possible. The verification required not just my login, but a specific encrypted handshake that, unless unless they were simply bypassing the verification entirely, falsifying the approval records after the fact. How did you find this out? I texted back. I noticed timestamp inconsistencies in the logs. Approvals recorded for times when the system was actually down for maintenance. Jake was sharper than I'd given him credit for. Be careful, I warned him. That sounds like fraud. I know, he replied. I'm documenting everything. 2 days later, Jake texted again. They fired the IT director, said he failed to maintain system integrity. A week after that, FBI visited today. Something about contract irregularities. And finally, a month later, they're seizing servers, complete lockdown. I think someone tipped off the inspector general. It wasn't me. I hadn't contacted anyone. I didn't need to. The system itself was the evidence showing approvals that couldn't possibly have happened legitimately. I was shelving books in the reference section when my phone rang with an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. number. I stepped into the staff room to answer. Is this Olivia Harlow? A woman's voice asked. Yes, it is. This is Special Agent Teresa Mendoza with the Office of the Inspector General. We'd like to speak with you regarding your former position at Meridian Defense Systems. My hand tightened around the phone. I see. We can conduct the interview over the phone, or if you prefer, we can send agents to your location. Phone is fine, I said, keeping my voice steady. After confirming my identity with several verification questions, Agent Mendoza got to the point. Ms. Harlow, we're investigating potentially fraudulent defense contracts approved by Meridian after your departure from the company. Our forensic analysis shows that several contracts totaling over $78 million were approved using your credentials after your employment was terminated. That's not possible, I said. My access was revoked the day I left. Yes, we've confirmed that with HR records, she replied. However, the system shows your digital signature on contracts dated well after your termination, the most recent being a $22 million software integration project signed just 12 days after you were let go. I took a deep breath. Agent Mendoza, I did not sign those contracts. I couldn't have. The verification system requires a specific credential that only I possessed, and I did not have access to company systems after my termination. There was a pause. Can you explain this credential in more detail? I explained the cryptographic handshake protocol I'd implemented, the way it was tied to my employee credentials, and how it would be impossible to replicate without my specific authorization. So you're saying these approvals were falsified? She asked. I'm saying they're technically impossible, I clarified. The system would reject any attempt to use my credentials after they were deactivated. If approvals exist in the system, someone bypassed the verification process entirely and falsified the records. And who would have the authority to do that? Technically, only the CTO, Marcus Wells, and the CEO, Grant Remington, had system-wide administrator privileges. Agent Mendoza was silent for a moment. Ms. Harlow, we may need you to come to Washington to provide a formal statement. I understand, I said. I'll cooperate fully. After the call ended, I sat in the staff room, staring at the wall. The trap I had set had worked more effectively than I could have imagined. Grant hadn't just tried to forge my signature, he had created a paper trail of fraud that led directly back to him. I returned to shelving books, moving methodically through the quiet library stacks. Life in Willow Creek continued unchanged, even as my former world imploded. 3 weeks later, I received an official letter requesting my presence at a deposition in Washington. The following day, Jake texted me a news link. Federal investigation targets defense contractor over contract irregularities. The article didn't mention names, but it referenced a major defense software provider being investigated for potentially falsifying federal contract approvals. A week after that, Eleanor handed me the morning newspaper as I arrived at the library. Isn't this the company you used to work for? She asked, pointing to a headline. Meridian CEO placed on leave amid federal fraud investigation. I scanned the article quickly. Grant had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. The board had appointed an interim CEO, Meridian's stock had plummeted 28% on the news. Yes, I told Eleanor. That's where I worked before. She looked at me curiously, but didn't pry. Well, their loss is our gain, she said simply, and continued sorting the morning mail. My deposition lasted 6 hours. I explained the compliance system in exhaustive detail, described the verification protocol I'd implemented, and confirmed that I had not accessed company systems after my termination. The federal prosecutors seemed particularly interested in the system logs Jake had discovered, the ones showing approvals during maintenance periods. I returned to Willow Creek the next day and resumed my quiet life. I didn't follow the news obsessively. I didn't reach out to former colleagues. I simply waited. The indictment came 4 months later. Grant Remington was charged with 19 counts of fraud, falsification of records, and making false statements to the federal government. Marcus Wells faced lesser charges but had apparently turned state's evidence. I declined all interview requests from journalists. I did not attend any of the court proceedings. I had said what I needed to say in my deposition. 1 year to the day after my termination. I was having coffee in the small cafe inside the library when I glanced at a newspaper someone had left on a nearby table. The headline caught my eye. Former Meridian CEO pleads guilty to federal fraud charges. The article detailed how Grant had admitted to falsifying contract approvals after firing the company's compliance officer. It quoted the prosecutor. The defendant attempted to forge a signature verification that, by design, could not be forged. It was the digital equivalent of signing someone else's name on a document that can only be signed with disappearing ink that only that person possesses. I took a sip of my tea and allowed myself a small smile. Later that afternoon, as I was helping a young girl find books about dinosaurs, my phone buzzed with a text from Jake. They're rebuilding the entire compliance system from scratch. New CEO wants to talk to you. I didn't respond right away. I finished helping the girl, then straightened a row of misaligned books before taking out my phone again. I'm happy where I am, I texted back. They're offering double your old salary, Jake replied, plus a signing bonus. I looked around the quiet library, at the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, at Eleanor helping an elderly man with the computer, at the children sprawled on cushions in the reading corner. Some things matter more than money, I wrote. But thanks for keeping me in the loop. I put my phone away and returned to the circulation desk, where a stack of returns waited to be processed. Each book had its place, its proper categorization. There were rules to be followed, systems to be maintained. And sometimes, just sometimes, those rules protected the people who believed in them. Grant never understood that. He thought rules were obstacles to be overcome, compliance a burden to be shed. You still think rules matter, he had told me that day in the conference room. He was right. I did. And in the end, so did the law.